Saivion Smith was taken off the field in an ambulance yesterday after what at the time certainly looked to be a very unusual injury moment. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and if it's your first time here and you enjoy learning about the medical side of what we see in the sports world, then please be sure and subscribe to this channel for all my future videos. This was definitely an atypical one that we saw yesterday with Saivion Smith. This play looked very innocent on replay, really couldn't appreciate anything in terms of a big major hit, but we obviously saw Smith just seemingly kind of collapse to the ground before ultimately being taken off the field in a stretcher and in an ambulance. Thankfully, the report today is that there's no sign of any issues with his neck, and he's in the concussion protocol, which all things considered is probably the best outcome after what we saw on the field. Looking at some other views of this to see if there was anything more apparent, again, there really wasn't too much here. We can see, of course, Smith is on the outside going up here against Henry, and Henry's obviously a bigger guy, so there's going to be more force behind any contact or hits from him, but there really was nothing that looked that severe or that egregious. I wondered at times if, maybe Henry's arm sort of got up underneath the helmet and sort of up above the shoulder pads of Smith. We hear about things like injuries to the carotid sinus that we'll talk about on the side of the neck and how that can sometimes affect blood pressure and lead to somebody passing out. So that's always one thing to keep in mind here with maybe some contact underneath the neck. But this wasn't like the typical big hit or big contact that we're used to seeing. Smith was involved on the play just before this, making a tackle here, and part of me does wonder if he might have actually sustained a concussion on this play, but just didn't actually exhibit any symptoms until the following play, which wouldn't be too unusual. Sometimes people can have a head injury and the symptoms just don't really manifest themselves right away, and certainly here there's enough where Smith goes down to the ground. You can see him at the bottom of this pile, maybe has some whiplash, so might have actually injured something on the play prior that just sort of finally set in with those symptoms and what looked to be loss of consciousness on that subsequent play. In a situation like this, the medical team gets out there on the field and they probably didn't actually see what happened. They just get out there and they see what looks to be at the time an athlete who's unconscious. Anytime we see a down athlete who is unconscious or has altered consciousness, we're going to be worried about the neck. And so while we're doing our initial evaluation, we're going to stabilize their neck because we can't trust the answers to their questions. We can't really trust our evaluation. So surely when they initially got out here and saw he was down on the ground, what looked to be unconscious, they're going to assume he has a neck injury, especially if he can't respond to their exam. The initial protocol here is to make sure that he's breathing, make sure he has a pulse and this isn't some sort of a cardiac issue, and then if there still is concern for the neck injury, get him on the backboard, get him to the hospital. The whole ambulance being on the field thing is honestly more of just probably a stadium protocol than it is a true display of the urgency of the situation. Every arena and stadium is going to do things differently. Sometimes they'll have a cart come out and then that takes them off in the stretcher and then the ambulance is back behind the stands. But here for the Patriots, they just bring the ambulance straight onto the field. So when we see this, don't always assume that that means it's something really severe. It's probably just specific to the emergency action plan or the protocol that individual venue has put in place. When an athlete gets to the hospital in a situation like this, you have to realize that those emergency providers aren't sports docs. They're thinking more about just an individual who came in from a sporting event, but they're also thinking in general just with somebody who collapses and might have had loss of consciousness, especially if there's no clear mechanism where the team doctors can say, yep, we saw the clear impact, we saw him get hit in the head, we really suspect a concussion. The doctors at the hospital are going to really reach that differential out wider and cast a wider net to make sure they're not missing other things. That could be things like metabolic problems with electrolytes. Remember, somebody could be really dehydrated and just pass out from that. You could have problems with your heart or with blood flow where you had what we call syncope or fainting because of impaired blood flow to the brain. So the doctors at the hospital are going to be doing some of those other checks to make sure this is not something beyond just the typical orthopedic neurologic things that we see in sports. Looking back at this, I think there is enough there to explain a concussion. We can see if we focus on Henry's right shoulder pad that basically as Smith has his head down coming in for the impact here, look at how much Henry's right shoulder gets deflected backwards. That is all impact from Smith's head. So all that is going into his head. It certainly could be enough to cause a concussion. And the challenging part of concussions is not everybody responds to the same impact or the same dose, so to speak, of a hit. A seemingly very benign hit for one player might be enough to cause loss of consciousness and a concussion, whereas in another player, that might have been totally benign and not caused any damage. Although the act of Smith lowering his head here to engage with Henry does make the chance of a spinal cord injury higher whenever you get yourself into what used to be considered like a spear tackling position, lowering your head down straightens your cervical spine and removes some of the ability for it to protect itself. So while that is a high risk position here, I don't think there was nearly enough energy, there wasn't nearly enough high speed of a collision to cause a significant spinal cord injury. You can have something called like a transient neuropraxia or a transient spinal cord injury where you basically get a stun of the spinal cord, similar to a stinger, but it instead affects the spinal cord rather than the nerves coming out of the spinal cord. And that would be a very short-term temporary thing. But again, typically would not result in any prolonged loss of consciousness like we saw Smith sustain here. So all things considered here, I think concussion does make the most sense. It's just one of those good examples to understand that not every concussion is going to present the same way. They're not all going to look like Tua. They're not all going to be from these big, hard, high impact hits. Something might be very simple and very benign looking, but can still cause a concussion. And so that's why we have to be trained to look out for these things and understand the proper treatment steps when we do see it. That's it for the video, everybody. No doubt this was definitely an unusual one, but understand that head injuries, concussions can present in a lot of different ways. No two hits are going to be the exact same. Players are going to respond differently from them. And whenever we see these protocols implemented on the field, remember that if somebody's unconscious, we always are going to assume there could be a neck injury and take those proper steps to get them on the backboard, get them to the hospital. Doesn't always mean there is a neck injury, but we have to be as safe as possible and assume that there could. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.